There's never been a magic formula to beat Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers, but there are some ways the Bears can attack this Green Bay offense and also support Justin Fields enough to put them over the top in Week 2.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can tell I'm a little bit under the weather, but we're powering through on the podcast here today, and hopefully the nasaliness of my head cold isn't too distracting for you. But don't forget, you can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. On the show today, we start with the difficulty slowing down Aaron Rodgers and this Packers offense. We'll look at some of the different things that Matt Eberflus can have his defense do to at least not make things easy on Aaron Rodgers. And we'll look at some of the things that the Vikings did successfully against them in Week 1 that the Bears can then apply here in Week 2, and also the role that offensive coordinator Luke Getsy should be able to play given his familiarity with Green Bay. Then we'll turn our attention to the Packers defense and what the Bears can do for Justin Fields to help make that a little bit easier than it was against San Francisco, avoid some of the slow start that we saw that week and kind of take some of the pressure off of this young quarterback before we turn our attention to some of the key matchups in both directions that will decide how this game is played out. Some of the strengths the Bears should try and minimize of the Packers and some of the Packers' weaknesses that Chicago really needs to go after. But let's start with Aaron Rodgers because that's what it's always going to be about in these matchups, as long as number 12 is the quarterback under center up there. And I think we saw last week that there's a lot still coming together in this new Packers offense. Well, not the offense itself is new, but the new players around Aaron Rodgers. A lot of turnover at wide receiver in particular, some change on the offensive line, largely due to injuries right now, and it's still to be determined what level of their offensive line we're going to get health-wise with tackles David Bakhtiari and Elton Jenkins, both a little bit, still coming back from injuries, and maybe one might play, looking a little bit doubtful at this point. Neither one played last week, and certainly those will be some matchups we'll get into in a little bit here. But I think in terms of slowing down Rodgers, given what's going on here, we heard Rodgers say last week that with the rookies that he has at wide receivers and some of the new players in the building, he said himself that he feels like he can't go off script as much, that he has to stay sort of perfectly timed and perfect. He can't pull his Aaron Rodgers magic as much and kind of pull a rabbit out of his hat and make these plays appear out of nowhere because, he doesn't have the Devontae Adams of the world to know where to go and be in the right place at all times, even when it's not exactly how the play was drawn up. And so for the Chicago Bears defense, then, what you need to do is force them to have to adjust and take away the scheduled, quick type of throws. It's easier said than done, but if you can force the quick stuff to go away and make Rodgers hold onto the ball a little bit longer, that's when you stress that relationship between quarterback and wide receiver. When he doesn't know exactly what Christian Watson or Romeo Doubs is going to do, or some of the other younger players rotating in there, even Sammy Watkins just as a brand new receiver back in there. I think Rodgers really wants to be able to get rid of the ball quickly, whether it's short and underneath or a quick deep shot where he can just sort of drop back and fire it up and load it downfield. And those are the plays where it's the timing and the rhythm that Rodgers can most easily connect with new receivers on because it's exactly how they've drawn it up. But if you can have your defensive backs from a game plan perspective be a little bit more aggressive early in plays, when they make that first move, you don't want to bite all the way on it. You don't want to give up the possibility of a double move because some double moves can still be quicker developing plays. But you have to be ready for those quick balls. And on top of those early plays in the routes, get to your receivers quickly. Don't try and bait him or anything like that. Just be there where you need to be right away in the play. Make Rodgers hold on to the ball longer because the longer he has to hold it, the more quickly your pass rush can get home and the more time they have to get after the quarterback. But then B, the longer he has to hold it, the more likely it is that the play will break down or that they'll have to deviate from the scripted, from the timed, from the plan of action for that play. And then the less likely that Rodgers is going to be able to connect with these young and new receivers across his offense. I think it's important to remember that we do not want to see blitzing of Aaron Rodgers. Blitzing Aaron Rodgers does not work very well. You can pull it out every once in a while, and certainly it's not Matt Eberflus's MO to blitz very much, but Rodgers is very good at saying, okay, here's the blitz, fewer players in coverage, quicker pass is going to be able to be there, and being able to take advantage of where those blitzes are. Overall, I feel fairly confident that Luke Getsy, knowing the Packers offense, gives the Bears a bigger advantage than the Packers knowing Luke Getsy and knowing the Bears offense. Because Luke Getsy, yes, brings the Packers scheme to Chicago, but it's not exactly the Packers scheme, right? They've adjusted it in bits and pieces to the Bears players. And so it has a slightly different flavor than what they've been running in Green Bay. But from Getsy's perspective, more so than the scheme, he knows the players. He knows Aaron Rodgers very, very well. He knows Allen Lazard, Randall Cobb, Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon, and most of this Packers offensive line. Like, he knows these players and has coached these players. And so he knows these players' strengths and weaknesses more intimately than any other opposing coach. You can see stuff on film, but he knows the stuff from within the room that they don't always put on film or that the team would intentionally try and avoid. And so I think Getsy can be a much bigger advantage for the Bears knowing the Packers players than it would be for the Packers having some familiarity with what the Bears might want to run on offense, because I think the Bears will have changed a bit more and the Packers will be less familiar with the Bears players than Getsy will be with the former Packers players that are all still on the team. So there's some real opportunity here, I think, for the Bears defense to pick up where the Vikings left off last week, make Rodgers hold on to the ball, get some pass rush home, and don't make anything easy on him. Make these receivers have to work and get in position to do so. And all of a sudden, you can start to feel a formula here for limiting the scoring of Green Bay. Your Bears offense is still going to have to hold up its end of the bargain and put up some decent points against a strong Packers defense as well. We'll kind of go into what we learned against the 49ers that you can apply in this game for the Bears offense and how we can sort of move some of those lessons forward and look also at what the Vikings were able to do successfully against Green Bay next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Turo. Turo is the world's largest car-sharing marketplace. With Turo, you can book any car you want, wherever you want it, from a community of local hosts. Browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the United States, Canada, and our listeners over in the UK. You can book a spacious SUV or a minivan if you got a family road trip, or maybe it's a special event, a birthday, a holiday, and you want to get like a classic, cool luxury car. Or maybe you're just trying to get from point A to point B, and you just want the most affordable economy car you can get. Maybe there's a new vehicle you have your eye on, a new electric car you want to try. You can test drive it with Turo and see how it might fit in your everyday life. Many Turo hosts can even deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. You have nothing to worry about. Terms and conditions and exclusions do apply. Ditch boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. We're putting together a game plan for the Chicago Bears to beat the Green Bay Packers and advance to 2-0, unbelievably, to start this regular season. No one thought they would beat the 49ers. No one thinks they're going to beat the Green Bay Packers, so let's do it twice in a row. When you look at this Packers defense last week, I do think much of what we saw is things that will be very correctable and that they should be able to fix and get back on the right track. But let's not instantly assume that they will have it all figured out in just the 7 days between games, right? You can't just say, oh, well, all that stuff that went wrong against Minnesota, it'll be fixed for week 2, so we don't even have to worry about it. Like, no, let's test those same things that went wrong against Minnesota and see if it's fixed in week 2. And, if it's fixed, then you move on to your other things, but you might as well take what's there and don't just assume that a team is going to be able to remedy all of these types of issues in just 7 days. So, like, what stood out in the Vikings game was a lot of miscommunication in the secondary between players that have played together for some time now and have played in this defense for multiple years. And that's why a lot of Packers fans feel like, the defense will be fine and they'll get their stuff figured out. But again, make them show you that it's figured out before you just give up on trying to attack what they struggled with. Like the two safeties, Adrian Amos, Darnell Savage, two of the better young safeties in the NFL. I guess Amos is more in his prime at this point. Savage still earlier in his career. We normally expect them to be very reliable, but they had a lot of trouble passing off routes and staying on top of deep plays last week. Justin Jefferson was able to really get by them a few times. And Justin Jefferson is a great wide receiver. And as much as Darnell Mooney is very, very, very good, he is not Justin Jefferson good just yet. So we can't necessarily put that type of expectation or priority on him to do that level of performance against this team. But I think you can still try and stress the communication of this Packers defense. In order to do that, I'm thinking a lot of like intermediate and deep crossing routes, having guys work over the middle of the field in breaking routes, those digs, those drags, the deep crossers, make the Packers defensive players have to pass routes off between each other. If you're an outside receiver and you go vertical, it's probably just going to be you versus the cornerback. Or if you break to the outside, right, it's just you versus the cornerback. And anything that's just like usually straight vertical or breaking out to the outside, like doesn't tend to stress as much of the communication of the defense. But if you can work over the middle of the field and particularly like that intermediate to deep area of the field, communication between like the first level of coverage defenders, the underneath defenders, and then the deep defenders behind them, that's where I want to test Green Bay's communication there. Because I think in order to limit Justin Fields rushing, we're going to see the Packers play a decent amount of zone coverage. I don't think there's going to be that often. There will be man coverage plays, but I don't think it'll be that often that it's just, man across the board, unless they'll throw like a QB spy in there, perhaps, in some of those situations, or alternate their cover one a little bit. But there's going to be plenty of zones there to try and have players with their eyes on the quarterback so he can't just scramble for 10 yards every time he drops back to pass. But I look back at what the 49ers defense did against the Bears last week and apply some of that to what the Bears should do against the Green Bay Packers this week, where the 49ers also ran a decent amount of zone in that game. And what the Bears try to do to Trey Lance too is they ran some zone quite a bit, but Trey Lance would hit those play action deep crossing routes, right? That's what like the main big completions of the 49ers came on, was play action deep crossing routes to the sideline there, where they got behind the linebackers and the cornerbacks, but underneath the deep safeties. And those linebackers and corners would step up on the play action and then leave too much space for, sometimes I think it was Ray McLeod had one, Brandon Ayuk had one, I think Deebo Samuel had one. Like they were hitting, it ended up being like a play closer to the sideline, but it had originated on the opposite side of the field. So it had crossed the middle of the field and no one picked it up on its way back across the middle of the field. And I'd like to see the Bears attack them in a very similar way. I also think the Bears should pick up on what they did more so in the second half. One of the adjustments they made against San Francisco that I think they should continue against Green Bay is being more intentional about getting Justin Fields going in the rushing game, right? Not just saying, okay, Fields, when you need to scramble on a passing play, go ahead and do it, but try and keep the passing play going first, and then scramble as a last minute thing and pick up yards where you can. I want more of an intentional rushing effort from Fields, but being also smart about it. That means not necessarily letting him get hit, right? Being smarter about how he slides. Fields keeps getting hit on these slides, but when you watch the way he slides like a baseball, like a pop-up in a baseball slide where you're going to slide and then jump right back up again, where his like torso is still vertical. His legs and butt go down to slide, but his head and torso stay up, and I think he's exposing that area to more hits as a result. I want him to go down and go as flat as possible into those slides so he doesn't take the contact. The 15-yard penalties are nice. They're not worth potentially risking an injury to your quarterback. But what I mean is that if your Bears running game is hitting the same kind of walls that it did in the first half against San Francisco, you got to find other ways to move the ball on the ground. And that's what they did in the second half. And I want to see the Bears be proactive about it against Green Bay too. That, of course, if I could run the ball with David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert for 5 yards a carry all game long, do it. Stick with it. Push as much of that as you can. Run the ball as effectively with that ground game as you can. But if The Bears' offensive line struggles again, particularly in the running game, against a pretty darn good front of the Green Bay Packers. That's when you got to get your quarterback more intentionally involved. That means more run-pass options, more true read options for the quarterback. The 49ers even did some design like quarterback power plays where there was no option. It was just quarterback is running the ball. Make it more distinctly part of your offense. A quarterback draw, something like that, to where even if your traditional running back ground game isn't working, you still have that threat every time. And then if you can get an extra player up in the box, it'll change the types of coverages that they're going to play in the back end. You might have more of single deep coverage looks, which makes the reads easier on Justin Fields. Or if they want to rotate that safety back, you can create space. That way, wherever the safety rotates to or from is where there's going to be space early in a play to get rid of the ball more quickly. So Fields can get into that rhythm and kind of get this offense going a little bit quicker than what we saw against San Francisco. I have a feeling the Bears are going to be patient again, and they're going to be willing to sort of go a little conservative in the first half, play some in the field position game, and really wear them down and come back in the second half again. That feels like the style of team the Bears want to be this season, but hopefully they are able to hold down Rodgers as well, so you don't end up in too big of a deficit to have to come back to later on this game. And I think if they challenge some of that communication and get the quarterback more involved in the running game, some play action, some of those deep crossers as well, I think you can kind of go blow for blow early on there with Green Bay and then try and wear them down more in the second half. There's a few key matchups in the trenches there and a couple of receiver versus corner matchups that I want to highlight as well that I think are really going to go a long way toward deciding this one. And it's not necessarily the biggest names that you might guess on the front end. We'll kind of go through where the Bears need to win their one-on-ones next on Locked On Bears. Ooh. Sickness has taken a toll on my voice. I apologize for those as you hear it slowly deteriorate through the podcast here. But this episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at betonline.net, your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports information this season. You can, of course, get your bets in now on Bears-Packers. I think 9.5-point underdogs the Bears are in this matchup at BetOnline, but you can also bet straight up on the money line or the over-under as well. Some individual prop bets for this, plus not just Bears football, but all of pro football, college football. Basketball season is getting closer than you think. We're in the thick of baseball season coming up on the playoffs, plus soccer, tennis, boxing, all the combat sports, esports as well, live in-game betting, and more. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your sports and events. So head on over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about all the trends and action you need to know. Bet Online, where the game starts. The big matchups that I start with in this Bears game, first of all, is where the Packers are going to be weak on the offensive line. So right now, we're not sure what the tackle situation is going to be. They were without both Jenkins and Bakhtiari last week, and the two tackles were okay. They're not Bakhtiari and Jenkins level, certainly not Bakhtiari level. Even if those guys do come back, they're not going to be 100%. But even beyond them, the Packers last week lost their left guard, Jon Runyan, and his replacement was not great. And Jon Runyan has not been practicing this week and is likely not going to play in this game. And so it's going to be the rookie, likely the Zach Tom, the fourth-round rookie, filled in last week at left guard. I'm assuming he'll be the same plan there. And he did not do great and looked more like a fourth-round rookie thrown into the fire a little bit more. So I'm looking for Justin Jones and Armon Watts, the two Bears' three-technique defensive tackles, to get more of that interior pass rush going. I thought they were quite disruptive against Trey Lance. They weren't getting home consistently on their pass rush. They weren't hitting the quarterback, sacking the quarterback, getting the quarterback to the ground. But when you watch that Bears 49ers game, so often the top of the pocket was 3 or 4 yards off the line of scrimmage. Like they were collapsing it enough to where Lance didn't have as much space to step up and had to step around and set up some of the times that the outside guys could actually get to Lance as, for either a sack or a hit after he got rid of the ball. And so I'm looking for those interior pass rushers to keep making that impact. It might not be sacks for them in this game either, but I think it's that interior pressure, it's that collapsing of the pocket just a little bit more that can make life more difficult for Rodgers to not be able to hang in there so long and step up and step around like he has done so many goddamn times against this Chicago Bears team. The other Packers matchup offensively that I'm looking for, we're expecting Allen Lazard to return for Green Bay, and he's going to be a big part of this game and one of those receivers that Rodgers is a lot more comfortable with. But it's the other receiver that he's more comfortable with that I'm really curious about. It's Randall Cobb in the slot versus Kyler Gordon. Aaron Rodgers has said he wishes he could have a team full of Randall Cobbs as opposed to a team full of Christian Watsons who are like 6'4" and ran a 4.2 40. Like Christian Watson and those other rookies, like they're very athletic, a lot more size, speed than Randall Cobb, who's older and a little bit smaller and just not as explosive as he used to be. But he's smart, he's crafty, and he's always on the same page as Rodgers. The rookies might not be, but Cobb always seems to be. Cobb's his go-to favorite guy, and he'll be matched up largely with Kyler Gordon in the slot, a rookie. And there was a lot to like about what we saw from Kyler Gordon in his first game. There were also some mistakes in Kyler Gordon's first game there. And I think it's going to be a real test for him now, not in the rain. Now he's had a game under his belt, though, and can feel like the jitters are going to be gone a little bit more. The Packers in prime time are going to bring the jitters back. I totally understand that. But like game 2, we can settle down a little bit. You've now done this before. You've won a game before. I'm curious to see how that matchup goes. If the rookie can throw some things at the veteran, because the veteran won't have as much tape to watch on Gordon, right? Randall Cobb can go back to college, can watch some of last week, but there's more that Gordon can do than what we just saw in that game last week. And Gordon can watch all sorts of tape on Cobb and get a sense of what he does and doesn't do well. So I'm curious how that sort of rookie versus veteran matchup goes for this Bears defense and whether Aaron Rodgers and Randall Cobb are able to attack a rookie that way or whether they end up having to go elsewhere because Gordon's able to hold things down pretty well in that regard. Flipping it the other direction, I'm wondering about Kenny Clark. The defensive tackle for the Packers had a great game last week. Really disruptive interior pass rusher, and I want to see how Tevin Jenkins does against him at right guard. Or if the Bears rotate in Lucas Patrick, Patrick's former team he's playing against. You know, he's practiced against Kenny Clark for years at practice. Like, how well is that relationship going to be? How well will he have the tips and tricks for Tevin Jenkins? So yeah, when Kenny Clark lines up like this, that means he's going to do this. Or when he reaches with his hand like this, then you need to know he's going to do, like he likes to counter this way. I wonder if the Lucas Patrick intel will help this Bears offensive line hold up better against the likes of Kenny Clark on the interior than other teams might be able to. Or will Kenny Clark just be too good, right? Is he just too talented to be able to have, even if you know what he's going to do, you still can't always stop him as much as you'd like? Because much like the Bears want that interior pressure on Rodgers, the Packers want that interior pressure on Fields to not give him room to step up in the pocket either. The other thing I'm looking for is in the running game in particular. Because as I was going through both Packers, Vikings, and Bears, 49ers, I noticed a trend that the Bears and the Vikings against different teams both looked to have more of their success rushing off the right side of the offensive line. Even when the run is going left, right, they tended to cut back and it found their lanes, between Borum and Jenkins and Mustapha. That right side of the offensive line was where the creases ended up being a little bit bigger. And the Vikings found something similar against the Packers last week, where a lot of their big runs ended up going off the right side. And for the Bears, like any run that ended up, like if they were going to cut back a run to the left side, they would always have to go wide left. There was never that crease in the left side of the offensive line. So it was always like runs were either going like super wide off the edge to the left, or they'd find some creases in the right side. And the fact that the Vikings offense had a similar pattern against this Packers defense makes me wonder if maybe the Bears can find running room in similar ways that where they were able to find it against the 49ers and may face similar walls to where they weren't able to find it against the 49ers. So keep an eye out on where on the offensive line the Bears are finding their lanes to run against Green Bay, and if it's able to be a more holistic, wide-ranging rushing attack, or if it tends to be a little bit more of a right-handed rushing attack. Because then, of course, if you're play action off a right-sided run, then Fields is going to roll to his left, and that becomes a little bit more of a trickier read and throw than rolling to his right, where he's going to be able to throw, be right-handed and already facing in the correct direction for how the plays are going to develop there. So a couple of matchups and a couple of little game plan things to keep an eye on there, and I think all of it feels like there is the potential here for the Bears to win this game and go 2-0, and for the Packers to lose this game again and start 0-2. I'm not necessarily here to say it's going to happen. I do think the Bears are going to keep this close. I'm not expecting, I would be very surprised, any sort of like blowout in any way. I know the spread is like 9.5 points at BetOnline. I think the Bears can pretty well cover that. I think it's going to be a one-possession final score when it's all said and done. But it is very hard to think Aaron Rodgers is going to lose maybe any game. When Aaron Rodgers is in there, especially given the history, we're a little bit trained to know how those outcomes tend to go. But never say never. The Bears have beaten Aaron Rodgers many times over the years and sometimes pull off some of these surprises. And this feels like as good of a time as any for this Bears team to upset the Packers. Some weeks you go in and it's just like, oh man, the Bears don't have a chance, right? That we've felt that feeling many times over the years. This week is not one of those feelings. This week's is one of those feelings like, okay, the Bears have a real chance here. I'm not saying they're for sure going to do it, but like it's as good of a chance as we've seen facing this team in quite some time. So let's enjoy it, Bears fans. And let's come back on Monday and break down everything that happens, win, lose, or draw, right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today and hopefully every single day. If you're looking for our second listen, the Locked On Podcast Network is your team every day. We've got your Chicago sports covered. Locked On Bulls, Locked On Blackhawks, Locked On Cubs, Locked On White Sox, Locked On Fighting Illini, Locked On Northwestern Wildcats as well, and so much more. So go check out those podcasts. Come on back on Monday for another episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity for you to bear down.